The rain was lashing against the grimy windows of my Portland studio, each drop a tiny fist pounding on the glass, mirroring the frantic, panicked rhythm of my heart. I had been in a state of creative flow just moments before the smell of turpentine and oil paint a comforting cloak around me. My brush was dancing across the canvas, bringing a client's vision to life, a small but crucial commission that would cover next month's rent. Then my phone buzzed, a serpent's hiss from the corner of my work table. I wiped my hands on a rag, a smear of ultramarine blue staining the worn cotton, and picked it up. A message from my mother, Eleanor. My stomach coiled. We hadn't spoken in weeks, not since our last disastrous conversation. My thumb hovered over the notification before finally tapping it open. The words on the screen were stark black against the sterile white background. They were not words of reconciliation. They were a declaration of war. The message stated coldly that the locks on the house had all been changed. It informed me that I no longer had a home. It ended with a taunt challenging me to see how brave I was, now followed by two characters that felt like a punch to the gut, haha. The air evacuated my lungs in a single silent gasp. The phone slipped from my numb fingers, clattering onto the paint-splattered floorboards. I couldn't breathe. It felt as if an invisible hand had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart until it was a small, cold stone. That house, the cavernous space of cold marble and glass in the West Hills, had never truly felt like home, not since Marcus Thorne had entered our lives. But it was the only link I had left to a past that was rapidly fading, a past that held the ghost of my father. And now that door had been slammed shut, bolted, and I was on the outside. The ha-ha echoed in the sudden roaring silence of my mind. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated cruelty. A sound I couldn't reconcile with the woman who had once sung me lullabies. For 2 days, I was a ghost, haunting the rainy streets of Portland. I slept on the lumpy couch in my studio, the scent of paint thinner doing little to chase away the chilling memories. Betrayal was a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders, stealing my breath. I felt untethered, an anchorless ship tossed on a storm of grief and fury. On the third morning, as I nursed a cup of cheap coffee, another digital serpent slithered into my life. An email. The sender was Samuel Croft, our family lawyer since before I was born. The subject line was a single ominous word: urgent. My finger trembled as I opened it. The message was brief, devoid of pleasantries. It stated there was a problem and that I needed to call him immediately. Before I explain the abyss that call opened up before me, you need to understand how the canvas of my life became so torn and bloodied. My world once was a masterpiece of light and color, painted by the hand of my father, Julian Vance. He was a brilliant graphic designer, but his true passion was painting. He saw the world not in objects and people, but in shapes, shades, and the interplay of light and shadow. Our modest home in the Laurelhurst neighborhood was filled with the scent of his work, a constant comforting aroma of linseed oil and fresh coffee. He was my first and greatest teacher. I wasn't his daughter so much as his apprentice, his shadow. He would spend hours with me in his cramped home studio, showing me how to mix the perfect shade of cerulean blue, how to capture the melancholy of a rainy afternoon with charcoal, how to find the soul of a subject and lay it bare on the canvas. He told me that art wasn't just something you did. It was who you were. He said I had the gift, a spark of his own fire, and that I had to protect it, to nurture it no matter what. Those were the golden years, a time painted in warm ochres and vibrant yellows, filled with laughter and love. Then the color began to drain from our masterpiece. Cancer. It was a swift and brutal thief. When I was 15, it came for him. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The diagnosis was a splash of cold black ink across our vibrant life. 1 month he was fine, complaining about a backache. 3 months later he was gone. The void he left was immense, a gaping hole in the fabric of our family. My mother, Eleanor, and I were left staring into it, lost and terrified. Before Julian's death, my mother was a force of nature. She was an elementary school teacher, a woman whose laughter could fill a room and whose strength seemed boundless. She was the steady hand that grounded my father's artistic temperament. We were a happy, normal, middle-class family. But his death broke something inside her. The vibrant colors of her personality faded to muted grays. She became withdrawn, anxious, a ship without a rudder. I tried to reach her, but grief had built a wall of glass between us. I could see her, but I couldn't touch her. 2 years after my father's passing, Marcus Thorne entered our lives. He appeared at a school fundraiser, a whirlwind of charisma and tailored suits. He was a real estate mogul, his name plastered on developments across Oregon. On the surface, he was everything a grieving woman could want: charming, attentive, successful, and seemingly devoted to my mother. For the first time since my father died, I saw Eleanor smile, a genuine, hopeful smile. And for that, I was willing to welcome him. I wanted her to be happy again, to find a reason to live beyond her grief. Their courtship was a blur. They married just 6 months after they met. And with Marcus came a tidal wave of change that swept away everything I had ever known. We left our cozy, paint-stained house in Laurelhurst for a monstrous mansion in the West Hills. It wasn't a home, it was a statement. A sterile architectural marvel with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city but felt more like the walls of a gilded cage. Suddenly, our lives were filled with house, staff, luxury cars, and designer clothes. Marcus insisted that my mother quit her teaching job. He told her she deserved to be taken care of, that she shouldn't have to work another day in her life. At the time, it sounded like a kindness. Only later did I recognize it as the first bar in her prison. The final lock on that cage clicked shut when my half-sister Chloe was born. She was 7 years younger than me, a beautiful, bright child who became the sun in Marcus's universe. She was his blood, his legacy, and the difference in his treatment of us was palpable. I was the relic of a past life, a piece of Julian's world that didn't quite fit into Marcus's perfectly curated new one. My mother, perhaps unconsciously at first, began to follow his lead. Chloe got the praise, the attention, the unwavering support. I got polite indifference and increasingly criticism. That mansion never felt like home. It was Marcus's territory. Every piece of furniture, every piece of art, cold, abstract pieces he'd bought as investments, screamed his ownership. My only sanctuary was a small guest room I had converted into a studio. It was my embassy of Julian's world. I filled it with his old easels, his half-used tubes of paint, and the canvases he had left behind. In that room, surrounded by his creative ghost, I could breathe. I could be myself. As I grew older, the chasm between my dreams and Marcus's plans for me widened into an impassable canyon. He saw my art as a cute hobby, a childish pursuit that I needed to outgrow. He would often remark that there was no money in paint and canvas. He wanted me to study business at the University of Oregon, or perhaps law at Lewis and Clark. Something practical, he would say, something that would guarantee financial security. My mother, who had once bought me my first set of professional-grade acrylics, began to parrot his words. She would gently suggest that Marcus had a point, that the art world was notoriously difficult. She would insist that they only wanted what was best for me. But I knew what was best for me. My father had taught me. What was best for me was the joy of creation, the struggle to translate an emotion into an image, the quiet satisfaction of a line perfectly rendered. It was not a life spent in a boardroom or a courtroom. The arguments became a fixture in our house, as common as the silent, white-gloved staff. Marcus criticized everything about me, my friends from the art collective, my paint-splattered clothes, the long hours I spent in my studio. He was particularly incensed by my decision to major in fine arts. My mother would stand beside him, a silent, pained spectator. Sometimes she would nod in agreement with him, other times she would try to play peacemaker, but she never, not once, stood up for me. In the quiet moments after a particularly explosive fight, she would come to my room. She would ask why I couldn't be more grateful for everything Marcus had given us. She would point to the beautiful house, the financial security, and tell me that he truly did care about my future. But I saw what she couldn't or wouldn't see. I saw how Marcus had methodically dismantled her life and rebuilt it around himself. He had made her completely dependent on him emotionally and financially. He had subtly cut her off from her old friends, the ones who had known her with Julian. He controlled every facet of our existence under the guise of love and protection, and it terrified me. I missed the woman she used to be, the one who would laugh until she cried, the one who believed in following your dreams. Sometimes when Marcus was away on business, I would catch glimpses of the old Eleanor. We would bake together or watch old black and white movies my father had loved. We would talk, really talk, and for a few hours the glass wall between us would disappear. But the moment his car crunched up the gravel driveway, the mask would slide back into place. She would revert to being Mrs. Thorne, the perfect hostess, the adoring wife, a woman who seemed to exist only to please him. By the time I tossed my graduation cap into the air, I knew I had to get out. My sanity depended on it. The constant pressure to conform, the suffocating atmosphere of disapproval, the pain of watching my mother fade into a pale imitation of herself, it was all too much. So I made a decision. Against their strenuous objections, I rented the small, rundown studio in the industrial district of Portland and moved out. I didn't know it then, but that act of self-preservation was the first step on the long, agonizing path that would lead me to that cruel text message, the lawyer's cryptic email, and the war that was about to begin. It was the first stroke of paint in a picture of revenge I never intended to create. My new life was a paradox, a fragile tapestry woven from threads of liberation and desperation. My studio apartment, nestled in a forgotten corner of Portland's industrial southeast, was tiny. It was a space of barely 500 square feet, a former storage room with wallpaper that peeled like sunburnt skin and a heating system that groaned like a dying man. But it was mine. Every square inch of it was mine. For the first time in years, I could breathe. The air wasn't heavy with the unspoken judgment of Marcus Thorne, or the faint, cloying scent of my mother's disappointment. Here the air smelled of turpentine coffee and the intoxicating perfume of freedom. The rent was a predatory beast that devoured most of my income, but the location was a gift from the gods of art. I was a short walk from a cluster of galleries and, more importantly, from Hartman's art studio, the renowned collective, where I'd miraculously landed an entry-level position. The pay was a pittance, barely enough to cover rent, and a diet consisting mostly of ramen and hope, but the education was priceless. My boss, David Hartman, was a celebrated sculptor, a man whose hands could coax life from cold, unyielding bronze. He had seen my portfolio and taken a chance on me. He'd told me I had a raw, untamed talent. With the right guidance and a relentless work ethic, he believed I could make a name for myself. His words were a soothing balm on a soul that had been scraped raw by years of dismissal. Marcus had called my passion a hobby. David called it a gift. I clung to that validation like a drowning woman to a life raft. My mother's reaction to my move was a predictable 3-act play of emotional manipulation. Act 1 was the guilt trip. She told me that after everything they had done for me, this was how I repaid them by abandoning my family. Act 2 was the cruel comparison. She'd mentioned how my cousin Sarah had just been accepted to law school while I was off throwing my life away on what she called finger paintings, a deliberate stinging echo of Marcus's disdain. The final act was a cold, brittle acceptance. She told me to do what I wanted, but not to come crying to them when I couldn't pay my bills. Marcus, as always, was less subtle. His disapproval was a blunt instrument. He told me, his voice devoid of any warmth, that I was making a mistake I would live to regret. The real world, he'd declared, was not kind to dreamers like me. And when I inevitably failed, I should not expect them to bail me out. Their words were meant to be anchors to drag me back into the gilded cage. Instead, they became fuel. I was determined to prove them wrong, to build a life so vibrant and successful that it would eclipse the long, cold shadow they cast. I threw myself into my work with a feverish intensity. My days were a grueling marathon, often stretching to 14 hours. I'd spend 8 hours at Hartman's cleaning, prepping materials, assisting the senior artists, and absorbing every scrap of knowledge I could. Then I would return to my own small studio and work late into the night, fueled by cheap coffee and a burning need to create. Slowly, painstakingly, my efforts began to bear fruit. My pieces, small studies of Portland's rain-slicked streets and the weary faces of its inhabitants, began to sell in local coffee shops and small independent galleries. They didn't sell for much, but each sale was a small victory, a flickering candle of hope in the darkness of my financial struggle. It was a sign that I was on the right path. It was about 6 months after my escape, on a particularly bleak Tuesday, when a final demand notice for my electricity bill lay accusingly on my small kitchen counter, that a memory surfaced. It came to me in a flash, a ghost from a past I had almost forgotten. Before my father died, in one of his last lucid conversations, he had told me he'd taken care of me. He had used his life insurance policy and his personal savings to set up a trust fund. It wasn't a king's ransom, he'd explained, his voice weak but clear, but it was meant to be a foundation. Enough to get me through college without crippling debt, and maybe, if I was careful enough, for a down payment on a small house someday. The last tangible piece of his planning, of his love. I had been so young, so lost in the fog of grief, that the details had blurred over time. But I remembered the core of it. And I remembered the terms. The trust was to mature on my 25th birthday. I was now 27. A frantic energy seized me. I dug through an old box of my father's papers that I had salvaged before leaving the mansion. There, it was a copy of the trust document signed by my father and Samuel Croft. It was all there in black and white. The money was legally mine 2 years ago. I picked up the phone and dialed my mother's number, my heart thudding against my ribs. When she answered, I tried to keep my voice steady. I asked her about the trust fund, the one Dad had set up for me. There was a beat of silence on the other end of the line, a silence that felt heavy and calculated. Then her voice, unnaturally light, came through the receiver. She told me, "Oh, that old thing." She claimed to think Marcus had reinvested it for me, that it was all very complicated. She brushed off my questions, suggesting we could discuss it properly when I came home for Thanksgiving. Her evasion was a blaring alarm bell in my mind, but I agreed, needing to believe that there was a simple explanation. Thanksgiving at the mansion was a masterclass in tension. The air was thick with unspoken resentments. Marcus held court at the head of the massive dining table, a modern-day king presiding over his sterile kingdom. He dominated the conversation with tales of his latest real estate conquests and glowing reports of Chloe's achievements in her elite private school. I sat in silence, a ghost at the feast, feeling more invisible than ever. I waited my patience, stretched thin until the dessert plates were cleared. Then I took a deep breath. I carefully began by asking about Dad's trust fund. I explained that I was thinking of buying a small condo instead of pouring money into rent, and that the inheritance would be a life-changing help with the down payment. The silence that descended on the table was absolute, a sudden suffocating vacuum. My mother shot a panicked look at Marcus. He placed his dessert fork down onto his plate with a slow, deliberate click that echoed in the quiet room. He looked directly at me, his eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. He said bluntly that the money was gone. My blood ran cold. I asked him what he meant, gone, my voice, a choked whisper. My mother jumped in her own voice, high-pitched and nervous. She explained that they had needed it for some investments. For the family, she'd added, her eyes darting towards Chloe. For Chloe's future. I stared at her, utterly dumbfounded. I couldn't process the words. That was my inheritance. From my father. The money he had set aside with his dying breaths to ensure I would be okay. I asked how they could possibly use it without even telling me. Marcus answered, his tone dripping with condescension. He stated that I was a minor when the decisions were made, and that my mother, as my legal guardian, had the authority to manage those funds as she saw fit. But I hadn't been a minor for years, I argued, my voice shaking with a mixture of rage and grief. The trust matured when I turned 25. That money was legally, unequivocally mine. My mother, bolstered by Marcus's presence, stood her ground. She looked uncomfortable, but her words were firm. She told me that Marcus was much better with finances than my father ever was. It was a dagger to my heart. She said he had made the decision with her full support. It was for the best, she insisted. I was stunned into silence. It wasn't just about the loss of the money, though, that was a devastating blow. It was the casual, brutal erasure of my father's memory. It was the realization that the woman sitting across from me, the woman who had helped my father draft the very trust she had allowed to be plundered, was a stranger. She was someone who would take the last gift my father had lovingly prepared for me and hand it over to her new husband without a second thought. Tears welled in my eyes, hot and furious. I told her I couldn't believe she would do this to me, that Dad had wanted that money for me, for my future. Marcus interjected, his voice laced with scorn. He said that my father had unrealistic expectations. He had encouraged my artistic delusions. He claimed that they were just trying to be practical. That was the last straw. Those two words, artistic delusions, were a desecration. My art wasn't a delusion. It was a promise I had made to my father. It was the very core of who I was. I stood up my chair, scraping harshly against the marble floor. I looked Marcus dead in the eye and told him that my artistic delusions were something my father had believed in, something he had valued. That, unlike him, my father saw more to life than just money and status. I left that night without another word. The pristine gates of the estate slid shut behind me, not just closing off a driveway but severing a bond I once thought was unbreakable. I drove back to my small apartment, the city lights a blur through my tears. The loss of the trust fund meant my dream of owning my own place was now a distant, impossible fantasy. It meant I would have to work even harder, fight even more desperately just to stay afloat. Life became a relentless grind. I took on freelance graphic design projects, taught evening art classes to tired adults at the community center, and picked up weekend shifts slinging coffee at a local cafe. There were nights I'd collapse onto my lumpy couch, exhausted from juggling 3 jobs, my body aching and my spirit bruised, and I'd wonder if Marcus had been right all along. Maybe I was a naive dreamer. Maybe I should have listened, chosen the practical path. But then in the quiet of the night, I would look at the canvases leaning against my wall. I'd see the paintings I had poured my heart and soul into, the honest, raw expressions of my own small life. And I would hear my father's voice, a gentle echo from a brighter time. He used to tell me that art wasn't just what I did, it was who I was. And in those moments, remembering his unwavering belief, I would find the strength to pick up my brush and keep going. I had no idea then that this profound betrayal was only the prelude. I didn't know that the discovery of what had truly happened to my father's legacy would ignite a firestorm that would consume us all. The revelation did not arrive like a lightning bolt. It came as a quiet, unexpected tremor on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in spring. I was sketching in a small cafe near my studio, the bitter aroma of burnt coffee hanging in the air, trying to capture the weariness in the face of an old man reading a newspaper. It was a self-imposed exercise to keep my skills sharp, a small act of defiance against the exhaustion that was my constant companion. A voice, hesitant but familiar, cut through my concentration. Looking up, I saw a man with salt and pepper hair and kind, tired eyes that seemed to hold a flicker of my father's memory. He looked at me, his head tilted, and a slow, sad smile spread across his face. He said my name, Abigail Vance, and then with a sense of wonder he remarked how much I looked just like my father. The man introduced himself as Walter Grayson. The name instantly unlocked a dusty room in my memory. Walter had been my father's right-hand man, his closest friend, and the lead designer at Vance Designs for over a decade. I remembered him from company picnics, a warm, jovial man who always had a kind word for the boss's skinny, art-obsessed daughter. He told me he had meant to reach out for years, but after Julian passed, my mother had made it clear the family needed space. His voice trailed off and his expression soured slightly as he mentioned her marriage to Marcus. There was an unspoken history in that pause, a dark note that made my heart beat a little faster. I asked him what he meant about Marcus. Walter hesitated, looking down into his coffee cup as if the answers were swirling in the black liquid. He told me he didn't know how to say it, but there was something I needed to know about my stepfather and what had really happened to my father's company. For the next hour, over the clatter of ceramic and the low hum of conversation, Walter Grayson painted a masterpiece of deceit. It was a story that turned my blood to ice. My father's company, Vance Designs, had been his life's work. It was a successful, respected boutique agency with a roster of loyal, high-profile clients. When my father got sick, Marcus, who at that point was just a new acquaintance with a reputation in real estate, had swooped in like a vulture disguised as a savior. He had offered to help manage the company's finances during my father's treatment to take the burden off his shoulders. My father, Walter, explained, his voice thick with regret, had been so grateful. He had been consumed with worry about providing for my mother and me if the worst happened. Marcus had seemed like a godsend, but Marcus's help was a Trojan horse. As my father's health declined as the chemotherapy and painkillers clouded his sharp mind, Marcus began his silent coup. He maneuvered himself into a position of absolute control. He presented my father with complex documents, convincing him to sign over increasing shares of the business. He claimed it was a temporary measure, a way to streamline decision-making during the crisis. By the time my father died, Marcus Thorne owned 51% of Vance Designs. He was the majority shareholder. The pain in my chest was so intense I could barely breathe. I asked Walter if my mother knew. He shook his head grimly. He said he had tried to talk to her to warn her after the funeral, but she was so lost in her grief, and Marcus was always there, a constant charming barrier. He intercepted calls, deflected questions, and eventually made it clear to Walter and the rest of my father's old guard that their presence was no longer welcome. Within 6 months of my father's death, Marcus had completed his conquest. He merged Vance Designs with one of his own shell corporations, laid off the entire original staff, including Walter, and essentially stripped the company for parts, absorbing its client list and assets into his own empire. The name Vance Designs, the legacy my father had spent 20 years building, simply ceased to exist. I sat there stunned, the cafe around me fading into a dull, meaningless blur. This was not a business decision. This was a desecration. He had not only stolen my inheritance, he had stolen my father's life's work, erasing him from the world as if he had never been. The profound grief that had been my companion for years began to change to curdle. It solidified into something hard, cold, and sharp. It became rage. A pure, crystalline rage that brought with it a terrifying clarity. My suffering had reached its apex. I was no longer just a victim of circumstance. I was the daughter of a man who had been plundered on his deathbed. And in that moment, a new purpose bloomed in the wasteland of my heart. I would not just survive, I would seek justice. The first flicker of satisfaction came with that decision. I had a target. I had a mission. That conversation with Walter was the spark that lit the fuse. I began to investigate with a singular, obsessive focus. I channeled all the energy I had been pouring into my 3 jobs into this one all-consuming task. I reached out to other former employees of Vance Designs, men and women whose loyalty to my father had been rewarded with a termination letter from Marcus. I dug through the boxes of my father's old records, searching for anything that might have survived the move to the mansion. I spent countless nights online navigating the labyrinth of public business records, tracing the paper trail of the merger, the dissolution, the transfer of assets. What I unearthed was even more sinister than Walter had imagined. Marcus hadn't just taken advantage of a dying man's vulnerability, he had actively engineered it. I found emails archived on an old hard drive where Marcus had sent my father misleading financial reports, doctored spreadsheets, that made the company appear to be on the brink of collapse, justifying his need to take increasing control. I found sworn affidavits from former employees who testified that Marcus had systematically isolated my father in his final months, preventing business partners, and even Walter, from seeing him alone. Then I found it. The ghost in the ledgers. The smoking gun. Tucked away in a folder labeled Personal, I found a scanned PDF of a draft of my father's original will drawn up by Samuel Croft a year before his diagnosis. It was clear and unambiguous. In the event of his death, the entirety of Vance Designs was to be held in trust for me, managed by my mother until I turned 25, at which point I would assume full ownership. His legacy was meant to be my legacy. Somehow, that version of the will had never been executed. The final version, the one that had been filed, was signed just 2 weeks before he died. It was a period when, according to his medical records, he was on a dose of morphine so high he could barely stay awake. That new will left everything, including the company, under my mother's sole, unrestricted control. Armed with a mountain of evidence and a heart pounding with righteous fury, I made what I would later understand to be the biggest tactical mistake of my life. I decided to confront them. I didn't want lawyers. I wanted to see their faces when the truth was laid bare. I drove to the mansion one evening unannounced, the trunk of my car filled with binders of documents. Marcus was surprised to see me, but he quickly composed his face into a mask of polite indifference. My mother, however, seemed genuinely happy, a fact that twisted the knife in my gut even further. She asked if I was finally ready to come home. We sat in their opulent, soulless living room. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I told them I knew what they did. I spoke of how Marcus had stolen my father's company, how he had manipulated a sick and vulnerable man. His face hardened, but he remained silent, letting me speak. My mother looked utterly bewildered. She asked me what I was talking about, insisting that Marcus had helped them through the worst time of their lives. That was my cue. I told her no, he hadn't helped. He had used that time to take everything her husband had built, everything that should have belonged to us. I began pulling the documents from my bag, laying them out on the polished glass coffee table one by one. The emails. The financial reports. The testimonials from loyal employees he'd cast aside. The draft of the will. I told her to look to see what he had done. As my mother reluctantly picked up the first document, her hand trembling, Marcus stood up. He called the entire thing ridiculous. He looked at me with pure contempt and called me delusional, saying I had always lived in a fantasy world where my father was a saint and he was the villain. I pointed to his signature on the merger documents, his name on the incorporation papers that had dissolved my father's company. His name, his actions. My mother's face had gone deathly pale. She looked at him, her voice a fragile whisper, and asked if it was true. For a single fleeting moment, I thought I had broken through. I thought the mother I remembered was about to re-emerge from the fog, but then he placed a hand on her shoulder. I watched horrified as she physically leaned into his touch, drawing strength from him from her captor. He spoke to her softly, his voice a venomous caress. He told her that I had always resented him, that I was jealous of their happiness and was now trying to drive a wedge between them with these fabrications. I screamed that they weren't fabrications. I told her about Walter, about the half-dozen other people who had confirmed the story. I pleaded with her, telling her he had taken advantage of a dying man and that he had been taking advantage of her ever since. My mother's face hardened, her features settling into a mask of cold denial. The name Walter Grayson seemed to trigger something in her. Her voice was sharp as she declared that Walter had always been jealous of my father's success, and now he was filling my head with lies because he was jealous of Marcus too. I couldn't believe it. I begged her to just look at the evidence, to talk to the people herself if she didn't believe me. It was Marcus who delivered the final blow. His voice was dangerously quiet as he told me I should leave. He threatened legal action if I persisted with what he called slander. I looked at him incredulous and asked if he would really take legal action against his own stepdaughter. He replied coldly that I was no daughter of his. I turned to my mother, my last hope. I searched her face for any sign of the woman who had raised me. Instead, she stood up and moved to his side, a loyal soldier. She told me it would be best if I left. That I had upset Marcus. That I had upset her. She said she didn't know why I was doing this, but it needed to stop. My composure finally shattered. I told her he was manipulating her just as he had manipulated Dad. I screamed at her, asking if she couldn't see it. She yelled back, her voice suddenly powerful, telling me it was enough. She told me to go back to my little apartment and my little art projects, and to leave them alone. I left, the sound of the heavy front door closing behind me like a final judgment. The confrontation had failed. My righteous charge had shattered against the fortress of their denial. I had presented the truth, and they had chosen the lie. My suffering, which I thought had peaked, found a new, deeper abyss. I had lost my mother completely. But as I drove away, a strange thing happened. The searing pain began to cool, hardening once more into resolve. The direct approach had failed. It was naive. Men like Marcus didn't respond to emotional appeals or moral arguments. They responded to power and consequences. My plan had not failed. It had merely been the first necessary step. I now knew the battlefield. I knew the enemy. And I knew there would be no surrender. The satisfaction I felt now was grim, but it was real. The war had just begun. A few days later, after consulting a lawyer who gave me little hope for a civil case and warned me to be careful, I returned to my apartment after a long shift at the studio. I knew immediately something was wrong. The door was unlocked, pushed open just a crack. My heart hammered against my ribs. Inside, the place had been expertly, quietly ransacked. My laptop was gone. My external hard drives were gone. And every single binder, every piece of paper, every scrap of evidence I had so painstakingly collected had vanished. He hadn't just defeated me, he had erased my truth all over again. The violation of my apartment was a declaration. It was Marcus's answer to my naive emotional confrontation. He hadn't just stolen my evidence, he had invaded my sanctuary, put his invisible, malevolent hands on my life, and reminded me of his power. Standing in the middle of my trashed studio, a cold, terrifying calm washed over me. The police came, took a report with weary disinterest, noted the lack of forced entry, and suggested it was likely someone I knew. They offered little hope of recovering my belongings. I didn't need their hope. I knew who was behind it. Proving it was another matter. My first desperate instinct was to call my mother. I told her someone had broken in, that everything was gone, all my work, all the documents about Dad's company. I told her it had to be Marcus. Her response was a blade of ice through my heart. She told me, her voice chillingly calm, that perhaps this was a sign. A sign that I needed to stop my crusade and move on. She told me that she and Marcus were happy, that Chloe was thriving, and she asked why I couldn't just let them be. Then, before I could even respond, she delivered the final severing blow. She told me not to call again unless I was ready to apologize. Then she hung up. That night, huddled in my car because I was too afraid to stay in my violated apartment, something inside me broke. Or perhaps it was reforged. The grief, the hurt, the desperate need for my mother's love, it all burned away, leaving behind something clean, hard, and brutally efficient. Marcus thought he had won. He thought that by destroying my evidence and turning my own mother against me, he had silenced me. He had made a classic predator's mistake. He had cornered his prey, leaving it no option but to fight back with every weapon at its disposal. He had taught me a valuable lesson. This was not a fight for familial love or moral justice. This was war. And in war, you do not fight with tears and pleas. You fight with strategy, with intelligence, and with a ruthlessness that matches your enemy's processes. The next morning, exhausted and hollowed out, I walked into Hartman's studio. David took one look at my face and pulled me into his office. The story came pouring out: the stolen inheritance, the usurped company, the confrontation, the break-in, the final cruel phone call. He listened without interruption, his weathered face a mask of quiet fury. When I finished, he didn't offer empty platitudes. He offered a lifeline. He told me I could stay with him and his wife Olivia until I found a new place. And then he said the words that changed everything. He told me he knew someone who might be able to help, a friend from college who specialized in corporate fraud. My grief had been a paralyzing fog. Now it had a direction. The plans began to form, not as a single grand scheme, but as a series of calculated, deliberate moves. My art had always been my way of processing the world, of finding the truth beneath the surface. Now I would apply the principles of art: observation, patience, understanding structure, and exploiting weakness to the dismantling of Marcus Thorne. My first target was not Marcus himself, but his most valuable asset, his reputation. He had built an empire on an image of unimpeachable success and civic-minded philanthropy. He sat on the boards of charities, his name was on a wing of the local art museum, and he was a darling of the Portland business press. It was a beautiful, gleaming facade. And I knew with the certainty of an artist who understands composition that facades have cracks. I started small. I used the art community, the one world Marcus disdained and therefore never monitored. I began talking. Not with wild accusations, but with carefully planted seeds of doubt. I told other artists, gallery owners, and patrons a story. It was the tragic tale of a brilliant graphic designer, my father, whose legacy had been lost in a series of unfortunate corporate restructurings after his death, orchestrated by his widow's new husband. I never mentioned the word stolen. I used words like absorbed, dissolved, and rebranded. I painted a picture of a grieving, naive widow, my mother being guided by a powerful, savvy businessman. I played the part of the heartbroken daughter, not seeking revenge but simply trying to preserve her father's memory. The art world is a small, insular community built on reputation and narrative. The story spread like wildfire through whispers at gallery openings and over glasses of wine at fundraisers. The satisfaction was immediate and intoxicating. For every time Marcus had dismissed my artistic delusions, I was now using his own contempt for my world as a weapon against him. He was a shark who never bothered to learn the currents of the tide pool he swam past every day. Next, I went after the evidence he thought he had destroyed. The physical documents were gone, but my memory was not. And Marcus had made another critical error. He had underestimated my intelligence. Before the break-in consumed by paranoia, I had spent 2 nights in a 24-hour copy shop. I had scanned every single page of my evidence, every email, every doctored financial report, every affidavit, every version of the will, and uploaded them to multiple encrypted cloud servers under anonymous accounts. He had stolen the copies, not the originals. A jolt of pure, triumphant pleasure shot through me. My suffering lessened with the knowledge that my work had not been in vain. With my digital arsenal secure, I reactivated my most valuable asset, Walter Grayson. I met him for coffee this time, not as a grieving daughter, but as a general outlining a campaign. I showed him the files on a secure laptop. I saw the fire rekindle in his eyes. He too had been a victim of Marcus's ruthlessness. I didn't ask him to go to the authorities, not yet. That would be the final checkmate. Instead, I asked for something more subtle. I needed a ghost inside Marcus's machine. Walter still had contacts, old friends from the accounting departments of companies Marcus had since acquired. My request was simple. I didn't need them to steal anything. I just needed them to look. To find the inconsistencies, the red flags, the unusual transfers that are the telltale signs of a man hiding money. While Walter's quiet inquiries began to ripple through the financial world, I launched the next phase of my attack. Target my mother. This was the most painful but most necessary part of the plan. I knew she was a victim, but she was also his shield. As long as she stood by him, he was untouchable, the devoted husband protecting his fragile, grieving wife. I had to isolate her from him. I started sending her letters. Not angry, accusatory letters, but letters filled with memories. I wrote about Dad. I wrote about the time he taught me how to paint a watercolor sunset. I wrote about the smell of his studio, the sound of his laugh. I filled the pages with the life Marcus had tried to erase. With each letter, I included a single, simple document from my evidence file, a copy of a friendly email between my father and Walter, a photograph of the old Vance Designs team at a Christmas party, a copy of the original trust document with my father's strong, clear signature. I never mentioned Marcus. I didn't have to. The contrast between the vibrant, loving world in those pages and the cold, sterile existence she now lived was the real message. I was reminding her of who she was before she became Mrs. Thorne. I was reintroducing her to her own ghost. The key felt like a cold, heavy secret in my palm. My mother's note was an act of quiet rebellion, a crack in the fortress I had been meticulously besieging. Marcus was in Seattle for 2 days, closing a deal. It was a window of opportunity so perfect it felt like a gift from my father's ghost. My suffering had honed me into a blade, and now I was ready to strike. The satisfaction I had felt in the planning was nothing compared to the electric humming intensity that now coursed through my veins. This was the moment of reckoning. I drove to the West Hills under the cloak of a moonless night. The mansion was a silent, hulking shadow against the starless sky, its vast windows dark and lifeless. I used the key not on the grand front entrance but on a small service door by the gardens, a door I knew was rarely used and never monitored by the sophisticated security system Marcus was so proud of. The system was designed to keep intruders out, not to track the movements of a daughter with a key. Inside the house was a tomb. The air was cold and still carrying the faint, sterile scent of lemon polish and Marcus's expensive cologne. Every footstep on the marble floor echoed in the oppressive silence. I wasn't there to steal or to search for more evidence. I had what I needed. I was there to plant a seed of paranoia and discord that would grow in the dark and choke them from the inside out. My target was Marcus's study, his inner sanctum. It was a room that embodied his entire persona: dark mahogany, polished leather, and a massive desk that was more of a throne than a piece of furniture. On that desk, arranged in a perfect obsessive line, were a series of silver-framed photographs. Marcus with the governor. Marcus cutting a ribbon at a charity gala. And in the center, the largest frame, a professionally shot portrait of him, my mother and Chloe, a perfect family frozen in a perfect lie. My hands, steady and sure, got to work. I didn't move a single paper or open a single drawer. Instead, I left a message. On his pristine leather desk blotter, I placed a single high-quality photograph. It was a picture of my father's old design team taken the year before he died. They were all there, laughing, vibrant, alive, with my father and Walter Grayson standing in the middle, their arms around each other's shoulders. Beneath it, I placed a printout of a single document, the signature page from my father's original unexecuted will, his familiar, confident signature, clear as day. It was an impossible object in an impossible place. It was a ghost. It was a silent scream from the past that would shatter the sterile quiet of his perfect life. It was a message only he would understand, I know. And I am inside your walls. The thrill of this small, precise act was exquisite. The memory of my own ransacked apartment, of my own violation, fueled the cold satisfaction. I was returning the favor. I was out of the house in less than 10 minutes. The ghost had come and gone. The next day was the opening of the Legacy Group show. The gallery was buzzing, a hive of Portland's art elite critics and wealthy patrons. My diptych merger was hung on the most prominent wall, a silent, brooding centerpiece to the entire exhibition. I stood to the side, dressed in simple black, watching as people gathered before it. I heard their murmurs, saw them lean in to inspect the fragmented text embedded in the paint. They didn't know the whole story, but they understood the narrative of it: creation and destruction, life and erasure. Then they arrived. Marcus and my mother. I had known they would come. Marcus's name was on the donor wall. His attendance at such events was a required part of maintaining his philanthropic facade. My mother trailed behind him, her face a pale, taut mask of anxiety. I saw her eyes find me across the crowded room, a flicker of fear and something else, collaboration in their depths. Marcus saw the painting last. He was busy shaking hands, his politician's smile firmly in place. Then a business acquaintance pointed him toward my work. I watched his face as he approached the diptych. The smile froze, then slowly melted away. His eyes scanned the vibrant, chaotic energy of the left canvas, then moved to the cold gray monolith on the right. I saw the moment of recognition. I saw his gaze lock onto the shredded, fossilized text, the ghost of my father's company entombed in layers of paint. His face, usually a carefully controlled mask of confident charm, went slack. The blood drained from it, leaving a waxy, pallid sheen under the gallery lights. For a full minute, he was utterly still, a statue of disbelief. The chattering crowd, the clinking glasses, the entire world seemed to fade away for him. There was only the painting, his crime, hanging on a wall for the world to see, disguised as art. He turned his eyes, sweeping the room until they found me. The look he gave me was not one of anger. It was something far more satisfying. It was pure, unadulterated shock, laced with the dawning terror of a man who realizes the game has changed, that the prey he thought he'd crushed was now the hunter. My mother's reaction was different. She looked at the painting and then at me, and tears began to stream silently down her face. But these were not the tears of a grieving wife standing by her man. They were the tears of a woman seeing the truth of her own life displayed with brutal artistic honesty. She saw her own complicity in the gray canvas, her own lost vibrancy in the colorful one. The foundation of the reality she had accepted for years was crumbling beneath her feet. Marcus grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh, and hissed something in her ear. He pulled her toward the exit, his movements stiff and panicked. The king had been dethroned in public, not by an accusation but by a painting. The satisfaction was a deep, resonant chord within me, drowning out the last echoes of my own pain. They would have gone home to a house that was no longer a sanctuary. Marcus, reeling from the public display, would walk into his study seeking control, only to find the photograph and the will on his desk. His shock would curdle into raging paranoia. Who had put it there? How did they get in? His mind would immediately leap to the one person he couldn't trust, the woman who lived in the house with him. The phone call came 2 days later. It was my mother. Her voice was a broken whisper. She told me Marcus had gone insane. He had torn the house apart, searching for bugs, for hidden cameras. He had accused her of conspiring against him of letting me into the house. He had screamed at her, his mask of civility completely gone, revealing the monster that had always lurked beneath. He had locked himself in his study, making frantic, angry phone calls. She was terrified. She told me she couldn't live like that anymore. She told me she was at her sister Margaret's house and that she had brought Chloe with her. She had finally left him. My carefully constructed plan had worked better than I could have ever imagined. The seeds I had planted had taken root in the fertile ground of his guilt and her dawning awareness. His fortress was crumbling not from a frontal assault but from a cancer within. That night I sat with Walter and David's lawyer, Sarah Connolly, a sharp, no-nonsense woman with eyes that missed nothing. I laid everything out for her, the offshore accounts. Walter's contact had found my mother's new willingness to testify against him and the entire sordid story of Vance Designs. Sarah listened, her expression growing more intense with every word. When I was finished, she leaned back in her chair. She told me this was more than a civil case. The wire transfers to the Caymans, combined with the evidence of his manipulation of a dying man and the systematic draining of the company, was a matter for the FBI. The final phase was in motion. The traitors were not just stunned, they were shattered, isolated, and turning on each other. Marcus was trapped in his glass mansion, a prisoner of his own paranoia. My mother was free but broken, forced to confront the wreckage of the choices she had made. The suffering they had inflicted upon me was now returning to them, magnified and relentless, and I felt calm. The burning rage had cooled into a focused, satisfying certainty. The ghost of my father could finally rest. His masterpiece of revenge was nearly complete. The final piece of my strategy was the most audacious. I decided to create a piece of art. A very specific, very public piece of art. I began a new series of paintings for an upcoming group show at a prominent local gallery. The series was titled Legacy. On the surface, the paintings were abstract corporate landscapes, stark geometric representations of office buildings and boardrooms, but woven into the texture of each canvas, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, were fragments of text. I used a gesso transfer technique to embed words and numbers from my father's old business plans, phrases from his company's mission statement, and on the largest, most prominent piece, the elegant flowing signature of Julian Vance. The centerpiece of the exhibit was a diptych. 2 large canvases side by side. The left canvas was a chaotic, vibrant explosion of color and text representing Vance Designs' alive, creative human. The right canvas was a cold, monolithic block of gray and black, utterly sterile. Embedded in its surface, almost like fossils, were shredded fragments of the documents from the first canvas. I titled the work Merger. It was a declaration of war disguised as art. It told my entire story without speaking a single libelous word. Every brushstroke was a blow against him. Every hour I spent on the series, the pain in my chest receded, replaced by a cold, thrilling sense of purpose. This was my revenge served on a canvas. The pieces were coming together. Walter called me one night, his voice hushed with excitement. His contact had found something. A series of wire transfers from one of Marcus's holding companies to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The transfers had started just a week after he had gained control of Vance Designs. He hadn't just stripped the company for parts. He had been systematically laundering its profits for years. The same week I received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single key and a handwritten note from my mother. It was just one sentence: he's out of town until Friday. It was a key to the mansion. My letters had found their mark. The shield was beginning to crack. I felt a surge of adrenaline so powerful it made me dizzy. The suffering that had defined my life for so long was being burned away by the heat of my own calculated rage. I was no longer the grieving daughter. I was Abigail Vance, my father's apprentice, and I was about to use the art of war to reclaim his legacy and destroy the man who had stolen it. The final act was about to begin. The end did not come with a theatrical explosion, but with the quiet, inexorable turning of the gears of justice. Sarah Connolly was true to her word. Armed with Walter's financial intel and my mother's terrified, tearful testimony, she bypassed local jurisdictions and went straight to the federal authorities. The FBI, it turned out, already had a file on Marcus Thorne. They had long suspected him of financial irregularities but had lacked a crucial piece to tie it all together: a human narrative, a clear pattern of predatory behavior. We gave them that piece. We gave them my father. Marcus was arrested on a gray Wednesday morning. Not at his office in a blaze of media glory, but at the mansion just as he was stepping out of his imported luxury car. I wasn't there to see it, but my mother's sister Margaret called to tell me. She said the news reports showed him looking utterly bewildered, the mask of supreme confidence finally shattered, replaced by the slack-jawed shock of a man who had fundamentally misunderstood his own invulnerability. He had believed his wealth and influence made him untouchable. He had failed to account for the relentless patient fury of a daughter armed with the truth. The trial was a somber affair. The courtroom was cold, the mood subdued. I sat in the public gallery every day, a silent observer. This was no longer my fight. It was a process, a formal accounting of a debt that was long overdue. Walter testified, his voice clear and steady as he detailed the systematic dismantling of Vance Designs. Financial experts traced the labyrinthine path of my father's legacy as it was laundered through shell corporations and siphoned into offshore accounts. The most difficult day was when my mother took the stand. I watched the woman who had betrayed me, who had chosen a monster over her own child, walk slowly to the witness box. She looked small and fragile under the harsh courtroom lights. She did not look at Marcus. She looked at the prosecuting attorney, at the jury, at her own hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her testimony was a quiet, devastating confession. She spoke of her grief, of the profound loneliness that had followed my father's death. She described how Marcus had entered her life like a savior, offering a security that felt like a lifeboat in a raging storm. She admitted, her voice cracking, that she had willingly handed him control, first of her finances, then of her life. She told the court how he had slowly, methodically isolated her, convincing her that her old friends were a bad influence, that her own family didn't understand their new life. She admitted that she had known on some deep-buried level that what was happening with the trust fund was wrong, but she had been too weak, too dependent, too terrified of being alone again to fight back. She spoke of the letters I had sent, the ones filled with memories of my father. She told the court that they had been like small stones dropped into a frozen lake, sending cracks spiderwebbing across the ice of her denial. She recounted the night of the gallery opening, how seeing my painting merger had been like looking into a mirror that showed not her face but her soul. She confessed that she had given me the key to the house, her first true act of defiance in over a decade. It was in that moment, listening to her lay her own failings bare, that the last vestiges of my rage finally dissolved. It was replaced by a profound, aching sadness. Her betrayal had not been born of malice but of fear. Her weakness had been a weapon he had expertly wielded against us both. The verdict was a formality, guilty on all counts: wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, tax evasion. The judge, a stern-faced woman who had listened to the testimony with unwavering attention, sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison. As he was led away in handcuffs, his expensive suit now looking like a cheap costume, his eyes finally met mine across the courtroom. There was no hatred in them, no anger. There was only a hollow, empty void. He was a ghost erased by the truth he had tried so hard to bury. Life after the storm was quiet. The mansion and all of Marcus's assets were seized to pay off creditors and restitution. My mother and Chloe moved into a small, modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood near my Aunt Margaret's house. The process of rebuilding was slow and painful. My mother had to confront the reality that she had been a willing participant in her own captivity. She started therapy, a journey into the dark corners of her own choices that she had avoided for years. Chloe, innocent in all of this, had to process the fact that the father she adored was a criminal who was not coming home. Our own reconciliation was not a single event, but a series of quiet, hesitant moments. It began with me visiting Chloe, bringing her art supplies and showing her how to mix colors, just as my father had once shown me. Through my interactions with my half-sister, I began to see my mother again, not as my betrayer but as Chloe's mother, a woman trying desperately to build a new, honest life for her child out of the wreckage. One afternoon, about a year after the sentencing, my mother came to my studio. She didn't call first. She just appeared at the door looking nervous. My studio, now in a larger, brighter space thanks to the success of the Legacy series, was filled with new work. She looked around, her eyes taking in the canvases, the organized clutter, the life I had built for myself. She told me she knew that sorry was a meaningless word after everything that had happened. Instead, she handed me a large sealed envelope. Inside were the official documents transferring the full, unencumbered intellectual property rights for the name Vance Designs and all of my father's original creative assets back to me. She explained that it was the one thing the lawyers had been able to claw back from the bankruptcy proceedings, arguing it held no monetary value to the creditors, only sentimental value to the family. She had fought for it. It was the only part of my inheritance she could restore. We stood in silence for a long moment. It wasn't the trust fund. It wasn't the lost years. But it was something. It was an acknowledgement. It was a beginning. The most important lesson I learned was not about the sweetness of revenge. The satisfaction I had felt in his downfall was real, but it was fleeting. It was like a fire that burned hot and bright but ultimately left behind only ashes. The real lasting victory was not in his destruction but in my own reconstruction. I had learned that truth is a powerful weapon, but one that requires patience and precision to wield effectively. I had learned that true strength is not the absence of fear or weakness, but the courage to confront it both in others and in yourself. My mother, in finally facing her own complicity, had found a strength she never knew she possessed. Most of all, I learned about forgiveness. It did not come as a sudden cleansing absolution. It arrived slowly, quietly built from small acts of understanding and the shared, painful work of healing. Forgiving my mother wasn't about excusing her choices. It was about releasing myself from the prison of my own bitterness. My revenge had set me free from Marcus, but forgiveness set me free from the past. That evening, I unrolled a fresh blank canvas onto my easel. For the first time in years, I wasn't painting from a place of pain or anger. I was painting from a place of peace. I picked up a brush, dipped it in a vibrant cerulean blue, and made the first mark. I didn't know what the painting would become, but I knew it would be my own. A new design. A legacy rebuilt from the ashes, stronger and more truthful than before.